Well, here's one. Open dialogue. What are you reading? Poems by Jalaluddin Rumi, a poet born in Afghanistan. Where are you from? Bosnia. Serbs and Croats, right? Is anyone else there? There are others. What color are your eyes? Green till Colorado. But since we passed Apache Canyon, they're blue at the New Mexico light. So then, what kind of Muslim are you? White. Yeah, this one. In the garden of a restaurant, a reddish-colored cat stares at tiny creatures in the leaves. Everything is so natural, that is, familiar. We sit around the cast iron table like a real family on an outing. And I think of my father. He was a miner in a coal mine. And I think of my father's father, who was a miner in a salt mine. I think of a black and white family photo from a time that makes me feel something like sorrow and not sorrow. Something from the glint of whose eyes only massive solar panels could make migrate into the language of poetry. I keep brooding as soon as I find a happy picture to amuse me. Mainly, I find myself forgetting. I long for beauty when life becomes completely unbearable. Everyone I know is like me. It seems we've come a long way alone in sorrow, only when we're weary, and it's then the grave of every one of us is in Palestine. And one more from this, which I kind of can't help reading because it's dedicated to me. The sun went down right to the gas pumps, then lost itself in the clouds. I'm standing on Telegraph Avenue and looking up. Czeslaw Milosz lives on the hill, and because of him, I think of my room in Sarajevo. And I think of that room's bookish utopia. I had wanted to show the symbols of Islam in the light of so-called Western metaphysics. And I wanted to renew the forgotten notion of Jesus, the boy wonder. But it all ends in pure desire. As I'm standing on Telegraph Avenue now, I feel like I'm ready, because there's nothing else I want to possess. Okay, I want to read, see if there's a way to do this. I just want to read a couple of pieces. The Cairo Notebooks came out in 1993, and From the Warring Factions begins in 1993 and is finished in August of 2001. And Scrap Metal came out in 2007, and I think of them as a kind of trilogy, but Scrap Metal I think of as kind of a commentary on what preceded it, and a kind of almost fed up commentary, like, you didn't get it? Well, let me try to say this more plainly. So I just want to read a couple of, one of the things that was curious to me, and it took me many years to figure out, was that in the Cairo Notebooks, for instance, there's a reliance on some documentary material, which some of it is torture testimony that I was involved in either taking or translating, and there's a very clear differentiation between that documentary material and a narrator. Very clear distinction. And at the same time, there are these very old prose pieces embedded in the text. And I want to just see if I can read through to give you a sense of that mix very briefly. The Cairo Notebooks. Going from the Grand Canal to Lido and seeing St. Mark's Square for the first time, the words, "I hear Arabia calling," kept running through my head over and over again. Like a long-lost amulet, I could finally feel touch me. What if either of them, now that it was over, the mother or her daughter, should appear among the faces that passed before him? He remembered the beginning and the end, but had utterly forgotten how they had moved together in between, whether he followed he or she him, whether their unpracticed voices had met and locked or ran on disparate, each cushioned by its own drum. Sometimes at night the curtains swayed in the rooms they weren't in, past the hall whose wood and thickly painted walls had been cared for so well. Once he thought her mother wanted him, or he her, a humid, windless night. She lay there before the open window, the curtains limp. He sat on the edge of her bed at ease but unsure, knowing it wasn't far to get water, but not wanting to leave her side, not wanting ever again to jar the stillness the children had never known after the untimely rites, the discreet violence of a life rearranged. The apprehension of the age was in her face, the gray here and there, neither penitent nor defiant, but considered, fully possessed. And if bodily comfort could have been his to give, he would have sunken his face slowly between her legs to make it seem as if it were a dream. But he knew she wasn't quiet, that unleashed to pleasure she would never want to stop, and only by not moving, by fixing the pain above her thick brows in his silence, could he truly provide any. He took his hand and held it to her forehead, letting the tears fall freely. He stroked her hair and gently kissed her eyes. She let her head fall back, her parched lips parted, lost to sleep, more than usual tonight and earlier. But he was so enveloped in her hair that he didn't mind. No sound of steps, no keys, no doors. They would be alone. Did she have men just for the sake of appearance, for that in her that wanted to keep reopening the wound? With him it was different. She knew he accepted the impossibility of it, and that made it all the more treasured. And because it was impossible, she knew he would be tender, knew he could burrow deep into her farthest recesses. She stirred, then turned and curled, pushing her head between his legs. He pressed her close and held her head defiantly like a precious object. Outside the night seemed about to burst, but nothing broke in wake of all the rumbling. The water would be filthy until the end of September, and by then this night would be cherished for its mercy by her companions, also cast off and wary of everything except the need to sift the pieces they had been left to reassemble, day by day, in each other's loving company. A small claim, perhaps, but one at least in which her daughter had a stake. To eliminate blindly at first, but with purpose, what she had no choice but to take as the ultimate cruelty of his silence. Words did different work for them, their lack provoking ire in one, tranquility in the other. If only the limits could be abolished, he thought, as if they never were. If only we could love each other voicelessly and without end, and in my silence find your peace. But it didn't get to that. He had never thought it through that far, though they surpassed this in their being together there, in her head between his legs, in his constant hands holding her so tightly. Her daughter's need to first expel him, to gather up her shards, to probe an even deeper layer and reach a place where tools could be recovered whole, made her afraid that such a bond of kinship in the sole company of women would draw them to a pitch that might prove unendurable. To take him fully and finally, as she sensed she needed to, would be one way to circumvent that, for it would be conclusive and wholly unforgivable. Had indifference driven her so far that nothing else was left her but a retribution so concise and willed it could be carried out on no one other than her only daughter? Was it so long ago that they had borne each other's fears in their knowing hands, held each other's hair, touched each other's lips? But why deny herself? She knew his silence would be perfect, a dolphin gliding through her waters, and she knew she herself was ready not to erupt, to contain everything he was so prepared to give her selflessly. Either way, they would be together till morning. In the dusty thicket, intrepid liberty traps light. I lost the Cairo notebook in Geneva. It had checkered lines and the word yellow was written on it in red letters. Here, in the whirlpool of the city, in the incessant noise of masses of refugees and exiles from different lands and of different races, among sad, displaced peasants in broad blue gowns who had left a homeland not their own to oppressors and blood-sucking landlords, to escape empty-handed to the distant and enchanting city of promise, and to try their fortune there as porters and street cleaners, doormen, or pickpockets, here his presence aroused no wonder or astonishment. Daylight never penetrated the room, so a weak electric light was on all day long. To burn the house down with the money in it, to revel in the power of refusing to loot, to strip the soldier of his clothes, put his weapons on the pyre, and let him go free, ashamed of his nakedness. Many dozens showed up in the mosques and swore on the Koran that they had abandoned their treasonous ways and were then reaccepted into their communities. The press reported cases in which weapons which were brought by the collaborators were not taken for use by the uprisers, but were publicly destroyed as a symbolic act of purification by means of total separation from items contaminated by the occupation forces. In the name of God, the merciful and compassionate, appeal, 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 appeal number 12, to our sacrificing people, to the mothers of the martyrs and to the mothers of the detainees and the injured. We want to assure the kings and rulers that we don't want their money because we're willing to starve and go naked, but we'll never kneel. Several weeks of heavy dreams, the air itself permeated by silence and the violence beneath it. The camp's war continues. Religious authorities have given residents permission to eat flesh, sea piracy, food and medicine seized, committee meetings, taking testimony, writing accounts, pickets, public discourse admits a breach grinding off to a halting start, rocket stages admit a breach, in the dusty thicket, intrepid liberty traps light. Tomorrow it will be someone even closer, submerged in a return that had begun when? At whom was I angry? When she called to say how good it had been, when it's all alien to me, and the intention of that desire carried by a language that grows out of itself and is the magic of fully living within the mother tongue. Anyone from someplace can feel it. The brutal anonymity, the ripe, the ready, the soft, naked flesh, memory of another time, this crowd, these vistas, not enough noise, excessively punctual. We're going, clippity, to the good, clop, people of Zamalek. The nurses that we met from Sabra and Shatila, happy to be in Gaza. Some people at the vigil have relatives up there. The doctor was quoted as saying 6 people died and she amputated the legs of 7 others gunned down when they rushed to meet the food trucks trying to get in. After all the cats, dogs, mules, and other animals in the camp were eaten, a mother and her 5 children committed suicide to avoid having to turn to cannibalism. In Geneva, all the revolutionaries stayed in 5-star hotels. Tel Aviv, the Ayatollah floats over the central bus station. Textiles, cassettes and tin, posters of Saddam whirl and spin over the River Jordan. Mine eyes have seen the glory. Okay, that's from Cairo Notebooks. So, I don't know. This is really hard to excerpt from. I'll give you a little taste and then just maybe read a few texts from the scrap metal to wind up. From the Warring Factions is a book-length poem in 5 sections dedicated to the Bosnian town of Srebrenica, where in 1995 there was a massacre of some 7,000 Muslim men and boys. And in this book, except for very brief parts, what I realized was in order to deal with this material, as opposed to in the Cairo Notebooks, everything had to be appropriated. I needed to use other language and have other language involved in, for instance, in the section, I'll read 2 of those poems, in the section that actually specifically deals with Srebrenica, there's 4 poems that end that section, which are all taken from words drawn from Shelley's Revolt of Islam. And one of the reasons why I went to Shelley's Revolt of Islam was it was one of the only English texts that I could think of with the word Islam in it, in any sense. And obviously Shelley's politics played a role, and the idea of Shelley's words speaking to this event seemed kind of important. So this works very differently than that, in a sense, and I'll just, well, actually, let's it's time. Let me just read you those few poems from the end of that section, because the rest is just very hard to get in clips, and then I'll read a few pieces from Scrap Metal. Well, let me read part of this. I'll skip in this section. The sun and moon in their reckoning, the star in trees bowed low, the kernel in the grain and the fragrant herb, the pear and plum trees so close to the window, like wool dyed and carded, like scattered moths now left to the wild, like inscriptions worn thin on flattened stones, like tamarisks and boulders in the shimmering haze. Love of the ruins inflames not my heart, but the love of those who once inhabited them. Not so much the house, but the roses, they tear me apart. Have you considered the water you drink, the fire you kindle, the birds above spreading their wings and closing them, as if they were the stumps of fallen trees? Because the world was watching, I personally never expected to resist the scheme which commanded us to forget the legendary. It was myself seemed held, and lifting it would be like pouring oil on an already burning fire. At the sound of the cry of the pilots, no stone will be on another stone. In the southern part, it was very strange, a kind of dead silence, for they say the breasts of the free are the graves of secrets. And questions of industry and idleness demonstrate that if we aim our action at the presence of the real and the messages of the unknown events, heroes, and records of the earth, then the sun of witnessing shines down. And if I am like them in the rest, I should resemble them in that, keeping the peace but not enforcing it, to save a town dating back to Roman times. For some reason at those moments you have no brain. You are so obedient that you do just what they tell you. Take the sign down. Do I have to tell you 10 times, get up there and take the sign down? The level of proof has not to be different than any crime committed. Is this for my wife? Yes, for you and your wife. Thank you very much. For days are long they have judged, and they have refused to consider fruitless and sweet the rewards they reject to be worthless. Muddy shoes, a pair of jeans, some moccasins, a piece of wire, and a leather jacket aimed decisively at the point where the religious and social structure is most fragile. We refer here to the women, especially adolescents, and to the children. Don't be afraid. I want to help you. Your people need not die. Just decide what you want to do. No matter if you're old or young, you'll get transport. For whoever is effaced by the real from confirmation is returned to the witnessing of others and affirmed in the ravines of distinction. And some people mean by the moment the time in which a person happens to be. Certainly with hindsight, we would never allow ourselves to be the victims of double dealings. For absence is the absence of the heart from the knowledge of the states that are occurring, due to the preoccupation of the perception with what is coming upon it. The minimum that it can create is that the principle of uncertainty, these people doing what they have done and knowing of our existence. In the days leading up to the tragedy, no one even complained. As they walked toward the gates, they just walked through. In the final analysis, overrun as part of an overall settlement, the enclave may not have been defensible. His hand on my shoulder, still trembling. To awaken public hope in the tide of human things, which, like an epidemic transport, can unlock with the slightest motion, eat with poisonous rust into the soul, the historical fact from which liberty derives all its recommendations, and falsehood the worst features of its deformity. The faithlessness of tyrants, the massacre and extermination of the patriots, the victory of established power, the consequences of legitimate despotism, civil war, famine, plague, superstition, an utter extinction of the domestic affections, the judicial murder of the advocates of liberty, the treachery and barbarity of hired soldiers. Add war to war, not as an obstacle, but as an instrument of its aims flawed from the beginning. Principle, timeliness, and substance stood in the way, heightening the risk. images rendered useless blur the distinction, raise unrealistic expectations, exceed the